The Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of the most decisive turning points of the Pacific War, a clash where the ambitions of the Japanese Empire collided head-on with the overwhelming momentum of American naval power. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. The United States, fueled by unmatched industrial strength and a relentless island-hopping campaign, was advancing closer to Japan's defensive perimeter. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just islands on a map, they were stepping stones to the Japanese home islands, and whoever controlled them would control the future direction of the war. For Japan, losing the Marianas meant losing everything. They understood that if American forces established airfields there, B-29 bombers would soon rain destruction upon their cities and factories. The Imperial Japanese Navy, weakened by years of attrition but still clinging to the hope of one decisive victory, gathered its remaining carriers and air groups for a desperate counterstrike. Operation Ah-Go was their final gamble, a last attempt to reverse the tide and halt the American advance before it became unstoppable. Facing them was the powerful U.S. Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Supported by fast carriers, radar-equipped aircraft, submarines, and a logistics network unmatched by any navy in history, the Americans sailed into the Philippine Sea with confidence. Their pilots were battle-hardened, their tactics refined, and their technological edge undeniable. Yet despite their advantages, no one expected how one-sided the coming battle would become. What unfolded over the Philippine Sea was not merely an air-sea engagement, but a dramatic demonstration of the future of naval warfare. Japanese aircraft were decimated almost as soon as they appeared on radar screens. American pilots swept through the skies with precision and discipline, turning the engagement into what would famously be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end, Japan had lost the heart of its naval air power, and with it, the ability to wage offensive war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did more than secure the Marianas. It sealed Japan's fate. From that moment forward, the empire could no longer stop the American advance. The Pacific had shifted irreversibly, and the end of the war, though still bloody and hard-fought, was now in sight. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began long before the first aircraft engines roared to life above the wide expanse of the Pacific. By early 1944, the Japanese Empire stood at a crossroads, battered by consecutive defeats at Midway, the Solomons, and the Marshalls, yet still clinging fiercely to the belief that a single decisive battle could turn the tide of war. This belief, deeply rooted in the Imperial Navy's traditional doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, shaped every strategic choice Japan made in the months leading to the confrontation. The Marianas, with their deep-water anchorages and immense strategic value, became the focal point of both hope and desperation. If Japan could repel the American invasion of Saipan and the surrounding islands, they believed it would buy time to rebuild air strength, protect the homeland, and restore confidence across an overstretched empire. Instead, the Imperial High Command found itself racing against a technologically superior and increasingly coordinated opponent. American fleet carriers, submarines, and fast battleships were closing in with overwhelming momentum, driven by a doctrine of sustained offensive action that Japan could no longer match. Intelligence signals intercepted by U.S. Navy codebreakers revealed every major Japanese movement, which meant Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet always operated with a strategic clarity Japan lacked. Meanwhile, shortages of aviation fuel, attrition of veteran pilots, and declining industrial capacity left Japan with little more than determination to counter the American advance. When Operation Ah-Go, Japan's final gamble, was authorized, it unfolded less as a confident challenge and more as a desperate charge from an empire running out of time. Even so, Japan assembled its remaining carriers, battleships, cruiser screens, and air groups into a massive formation stretching across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was a last attempt to reassert dominance over the skies, to throw the full weight of their naval aviation heritage at an enemy they hoped they could still surprise. But America was ready. With radar-directed fighters, superior training programs, and a logistical machine capable of sustaining prolonged combat, the U.S. Navy entered the battle not as a cautious defender, but as a confident force poised to break the last operational strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Thus, the confrontation that would later be known as one of the most decisive naval-air battles in history began with two fleets sailing toward one another, one propelled by fading ambition, the other by unstoppable momentum, and the vast Pacific waiting silently to witness the end of Japan's carrier era. As dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, the calm waters beneath the rising sun concealed the extraordinary battle that was about to erupt. The Japanese mobile fleet, stretched across a vast arc of ocean, had launched its first major wave of aircraft toward the American Fifth Fleet. Their goal was simple yet ambitious: break through the formidable American defenses, cripple the carrier groups supporting the Marianas invasion, and reclaim strategic control over the Pacific. But the pilots flying these missions did not know they were heading into a network of detection, coordination, and firepower far superior to anything Japan had encountered before. American radar, perfected through years of technological refinement, detected the incoming formations long before they arrived within visual range. Fighter direction officers aboard U.S. carriers plotted every blip on their screens with scientific precision, dispatching wings of F-6F Hellcats to intercept the attackers. These pilots, hardened by extensive training programs and prior combat experiences, launched into the skies knowing that the outcome of the battle, and perhaps the entire Pacific campaign, rested on their ability to repel wave after wave of enemy aircraft. As the first groups of Japanese planes approached the outer perimeter, the Hellcats swooped down with shocking swiftness. Dogfights exploded across the sky, the air filled with tracer fire, spiraling smoke trails, and the thunder of engines pushed to their limits. Many Japanese pilots rushed into service with minimal training, found themselves overwhelmed before they could even identify their targets. The Americans' advantage in altitude, communication, and weaponry became immediately apparent. Entire Japanese formations disintegrated under the Hellcats' relentless attacks, marking the beginning of what U.S. aviators would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Despite the chaos, a few Japanese aircraft managed to break through and dive toward the American carriers. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in synchronized fury, filling the sky with a deadly curtain of explosive fire. The precise coordination between shipboard gunners and airborne fighters represented years of hard-earned experience and technological superiority. The Japanese bombers that survived the initial assaults found themselves flying through a nightmare of shrapnel and fire, their chances of inflicting significant damage dwindling with every second. By midday, the pattern of the battle was clear. Japan launched wave after wave of aircraft, only for each to be intercepted, broken apart, and largely destroyed before reaching the main American fleet. Meanwhile, American pilots rotated through the skies with efficiency, returning to their carriers to refuel and rearm before returning to the fight. Throughout the day, the sea and sky alike became graveyards for Japanese aviation. The Imperial Navy was losing not only aircraft, but the irreplaceable pilots who flew them, veterans whose skills could not be reproduced by Japan's strained training programs. The American fleet, by contrast, held its formation, shielded by layers of defensive power. By the time the sun began its descent, the largest carrier battle in history had entered a new phase. Japan had thrown its best remaining air power into the fight, only to watch it vanish into the sea and sky. The first contact had ended in staggering imbalance, setting the stage for the next day's operations when the United States would transition from defense to decisive offense. The battle was no longer simply a clash of fleets, it had become the moment the Pacific shifted irrevocably in America's favor. As the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon on June 20, 1944, a tense expectation settled across the decks of the American carrier groups. The first day of the Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended with overwhelming U.S. defensive success, but the overall objective remained incomplete. Japan's carriers, though crippled and nearly stripped of their air power, were still afloat somewhere west of the Marianas. Admiral Raymond Spruance, cautious and aware of the strategic stakes, wished to preserve the integrity of the Marianas invasion fleet. Yet Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the fast carrier forces, recognized an opportunity too great to ignore. If the U.S. could locate the retreating Japanese fleet before sunset, it could deliver a decisive strike, one that would destroy Japan's carrier strength forever. For hours, the Americans had launched scout planes, each combing vast stretches of ocean in search of the fleeing enemy. When a returning search aircraft radioed the long-awaited sighting report, a cluster of Japanese ships far to the west, a wave of energy surged through the American carriers. Mitcher, seizing the opportunity despite the late hour, ordered what would become one of the most daring long-range carrier strikes of the entire Pacific War. In minutes, flight decks erupted with controlled chaos. Mechanics, ordnance crews, and deckhands worked with synchronized intensity, arming aircraft with bombs and torpedoes while pilots scrambled to their stations. The wind howled across the decks as engines roared to life. One by one, aircraft surged forward and lifted into the darkening skies, forming vast strike groups that stretched across miles of airspace. The mission was clear: find the Japanese fleet, strike with overwhelming force, and return safely before nightfall, if such a return was even possible. As the strike groups raced westward, the ocean below turned darker with every passing minute. Pilots knew they were pushing the limits of their range. Many accepted the likelihood they might have to ditch in the ocean after the attack. Still, the urgency of the mission steeled their resolve. The fate of future battles depended on eliminating Japan's ability to wage carrier warfare. After a long, tense flight, the American formations finally sighted their targets. The Japanese fleet appeared as faint silhouettes at first, small, distant shapes etched against the shimmering water. But as the Americans descended, details sharpened. The long flight decks of Japanese carriers, the wakes trailing behind cruisers, and the hurried maneuvers of destroyers gearing up for defense. What followed was a coordinated assault of staggering intensity. Dive bombers plummeted from great altitudes, their sirens wailing as they released their payloads with lethal precision. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves, threading through anti-aircraft fire to launch their deadly ordnance. Fighters strafed exposed decks, cutting down gunners and igniting fuel lines. The Japanese fleet, already weakened and lacking its experienced air crews, struggled to respond effectively. The carrier Hayo suffered catastrophic damage when bombs ignited fuel stores below deck. Flames roared upward, engulfing the vessel until a massive explosion tore through its hull and sent it sinking beneath the waves. Other carriers, Zukaku, the last surviving veteran of Pearl Harbor, along with Junyo and Chiyoda, took heavy damage as bombs punched through their decks. The Japanese fleet staggered under the weight of the onslaught, its precious carrier force shattered beyond recovery. Yet even in triumph, the Americans faced their own ordeal. Darkness had begun to swallow the sky, and the long journey back to their carriers loomed like a perilous gauntlet. Pilots navigated by fading light and instinct, fuel gauges dipping dangerously close to empty. Admiral Mitcher, understanding the danger, made a bold decision. He ordered the carriers to turn on their lights, an act unprecedented in wartime and extraordinarily risky. Floodlights illuminated towering flight decks, transforming the carriers into glowing targets in the night. But the decision likely saved dozens of lives. One by one, aircraft limped home, some damaged, others running on fumes. Pilots who missed the deck circled again with dwindling hope. Some were forced to ditch into the sea, where rescue crews would search through the darkness. When the final aircraft landed or splashed into the ocean, the grim tally began. Though the Americans had lost many planes returning from the strike, the cost paled in comparison to the destruction inflicted upon Japan. The long-range attack had changed everything. The Japanese carrier fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now a broken, burning remnant of its former self. The U.S. Navy's daring offensive had severed Japan's last thread of naval air power. The horizon that night shimmered with the glow of distant flames, marking the end of an era and the dawn of American dominance in the Pacific. In the deep night of June 20, 1944, the Philippine Sea bore silent witness to the moment Japan's carrier aviation died, and the once mighty empire's fate was sealed. By the close of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Pacific had forever shifted in favor of the United States. The once formidable Imperial Japanese Navy, defined for decades by the prowess of its carrier aviation, emerged from the confrontation battered beyond recovery. In the wake of the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan faced a grim strategic reality. Its air groups were shattered, its carrier decks emptied, and its remaining naval forces rendered structurally incapable of challenging American sea power again. The battle marked more than a tactical victory. It signaled the irreversible collapse of Japan's ability to wage offensive naval warfare. Japan's losses were staggering. Hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and a generation of trained aviators had been wiped out in a matter of hours. The gap between Japanese and American pilot quality, already wide, now became unbridgeable. The few surviving Japanese airmen returned to their carriers, haunted and exhausted, fully aware that the soul of their naval power had been torn away. Without trained crews, Japan's massive carrier hulls became little more than floating symbols of a lost age. Industrial shortages, dwindling fuel supplies, and the collapse of pilot training pipelines left the Imperial Navy with no means to rebuild what had been destroyed. For the United States, the battle's outcome validated years of investment in radar technology, advanced fighter training, logistics, and carrier doctrine. American naval aviation entered a new era characterized by overwhelming capability. The Fifth Fleet's fighter direction teams, equipped with cutting-edge radar systems, had shown the world that air defense could be coordinated with near-surgical precision. The encounter also proved the strategic value of sustained, long-range offensive operations, something Japan had once mastered but could no longer match. In the months that followed, the U.S. pressed its advantage aggressively. The Marianas became air bases from which B-29 superfortresses launched devastating bombing campaigns directly against the Japanese home islands. The loss at the Philippine Sea meant Japan could not prevent these attacks, nor disrupt the expanding American supply network that fed the Pacific war machine. The Imperial Command understood too late that the defeat was not temporary. It was structural, and it would shape the final year of the conflict. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the battle was psychological. For the Japanese public, news of the defeat, initially filtered and minimized, eventually revealed the fragility of the empire's war effort. For the Americans, the victory emboldened both military and civilian leaders, who increasingly saw unconditional victory as inevitable. Admiral Raymond Spruance and the aviators of the Fifth Fleet became symbols of a new era of naval warfare, one in which carrier strike groups had become the central instrument of global military power. When historians look back on the Pacific War, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as a turning point, an unmistakable moment when the initiative passed permanently from the Japanese Empire to the United States. More than ships sunk or aircraft destroyed, it marked the death of Japan's naval air arm and the birth of an American dominance of the Pacific that would last long beyond 1945. The battle's legacy endures in modern naval doctrine, in the strategic thinking of carrier operations, and in the solemn recognition that mastery of the skies decides the fate of fleets. The Philippine Sea did not merely close a chapter of the war, it closed an era, leaving behind a transformed Pacific and a Japan forced to confront a war it could no longer win.